here. My name is Quentin Palfrey. I'm a Democrat running for lieutenant governor. And the focus of my campaign, the focus of my career has been the fight against poverty and inequality. So I grew up in Worcester County. My parents were pediatricians, and I grew up going with my dad into Roxbury and Dorchester, where he was working with kids in some of the poorest populations in Boston. And then when I got a little bit older, I founded a literacy program, which went into public housing facilities and homeless shelters in Boston and taught literacy and English as a second language. And then when I graduated from college, I went to the Philippines for a couple of years and ran a nonprofit that focused on child abuse issues. And my most recent job was being the director of the Poverty Lab at MIT, which uses evidence-based policy, this very sort of MIT kind of a way, to make sure that we direct resources towards the programs that are most effective. So I've been working on poverty and inequality issues for a long time. But I'm also a lawyer, and I've been involved in Democratic Party politics for a long time as well. When I graduated from law school, I made my way into the Attorney General's office, and I was there at a really interesting time. I worked my way up to be the chief of the healthcare division during the time that we were doing health reform. And then as now, we were working on some really complicated issues about expanding access to coverage, about quality, about cost, about racial disparities, and we were really the consumer voice in those conversations. We would work with Healthcare for All and Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, with SEIU 1199, to make sure that consumers, people of color, and people with less means were getting a fair shake in the healthcare system. I also have been involved in a lot of campaigns, and my area of interest in campaigns has generally been in voter suppression. So unfortunately, we have essentially a two-tiered electoral system in this country, where younger people and people of color, people who move around a lot, often face barriers to registering and voting that just aren't the experience of other folks in this system. And I've been working on this for a really long time. And this is how I got to know Barack Obama. So I was working in New Hampshire in 2004 and started to get to know President Obama when he started to work on the primaries in New Hampshire leading up to 2008. And I saw in him some of the same things that we all came to see, a truly visionary leader. And I started to follow him around from state to state. I went to 7 states during the primary, and I was in Ohio in the general election. And I was the voter protection director of one of the battleground states that we were most focused on. And I was very interested in trying to overcome some of the challenges we'd seen in the last election. Do you all remember in 2004 some of those lines in Cleveland and in Columbus, African-American communities where they'd wait 3-4 hours to vote? So my job in Ohio for Obama was to make sure that those kinds of challenges didn't affect those populations and didn't get in the way of our campaign. We put 4,000 lawyers into the field that year. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court. We went to the Ohio Supreme Court. And I was proud to be part of an effort that led to this transformational presidency. And I was also proud of what came next, which is I had an opportunity to go to Washington as a political appointee in President Obama's administration. So first I went into the Commerce Department, and then I found my way into the White House, where I was senior advisor for jobs and competitiveness. And we were working at the time, as you know, to claw our way out of one of the worst recessions since the Great Depression. We were also very focused on this notion that rising inequality is one of the great social policy challenges of our time. And so I was part of a group of people that was working to make an economy that works for everybody. And I was proud to be part of that generation. I was also proud to have an opportunity to brief the president directly on a piece of legislation that got over the finish line. And my children, I have 3 children. Drew is 8, Serena is 6, and I now have an 8-month-old now named Max, sort of grew up in and around the White House. It was a magical time for us. They would trick or treat in the halls of the White House. Got to meet the president in the Oval Office. We got to meet the First Lady. It was a really extraordinary time. And last year, like many of you, I worked hard to try to elect a president who would carry on the same legacy that President Obama and our generation had built. And, sorry, it hasn't happened to me before. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, I've been devastated by what's come after that. There's a certain cruelty to this administration that seems to want to rip families apart or put walls between us and our neighbors, knock tens of millions of people off of health insurance. There's also an attack on the fundamental norms of our democracy. They don't believe in truth. They don't believe in science. They seem to attack the Constitution. And I think we process this in a bunch of different ways. First, I think we hoped that maybe they'd pivot. Maybe they'd moderate. They couldn't possibly be this bad, could they? And I think we've seen pretty quickly that they're going to double down on every divisive tactic. And I think we've turned in our collective imagination to Bob Mueller and hoping that that crack team of lawyers is going to disentangle this sordid set of entanglements between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. And the problem is, it's not going to actually solve the problem. This party, the Republican Party, has been hijacked. And they're dismantling bit by bit the social safety net and what the federal government agencies are doing. And we absolutely need to take back the Congress. But that's mostly defense. That's mostly blocking some of the outrageous stuff like them taking away $1.5 trillion and giving it to the very, very richest people in Wall Street and the corporations. For us to actually solve problems that really affect people, we're going to have to do it at the state level. And that brings me to Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is this extraordinary place. We're here in Quincy. This is where the revolution was built, right? This is where the Constitution was born. We led the way on the abolitionist movement here. We led the way towards equal marriage and towards universal access to health care. And I think that the world and the country need for Massachusetts to lead again. And I don't just mean resistance. We absolutely need to fight back on every divisive and horrible thing that comes out of Washington. But with a terrific congressional delegation, led by Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey, with wonderful constitutional officers, and with massive majorities in both houses of the legislature, we can do what other states can only dream of. We can raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We can get paid family leave. We can pass the Millionaires Tax and really invest in transportation and education, in real solutions to the opioid crisis. We can move towards truly universal access to care. We can solve some of the problems with our democratic system, pass automatic voter registration, have early vote for every election, have same-day registration. We can solve some of the real problems in our criminal justice system. So what is the role of the lieutenant governor in all this? So there are three pieces of the lieutenant governor's role that I'm really excited about. And the first one is that the lieutenant governor historically has been the bridge between the governor's office and cities and towns. Now, cities and towns are actually where a lot of the things that affect people happen. Housing, education, transportation, opioid crisis. These are local issues, and the lieutenant governor is often the bridge who can help solve those problems. Also, the lieutenant governor has sometimes been a bridge to Washington. Now, I worked in the White House, I worked in the Commerce Department, I worked for a member of Congress, and I'd like to help the next administration navigate some really difficult issues in the federal government that's broken. And that's mostly defense, but we still have a lot at stake in our Medicaid waiver, in block grants, in an ICE that is picking on our cities and trying to rip our families apart. And then also there's the Governor's Council. So the Lieutenant Governor is the chair of the Governor's Council. And I'm a lawyer who cares about civil rights. And I think that the Governor's Council would be a wonderful platform to talk about criminal justice reform. We imprison too many people for too long for doing too little, and race has way too much to do with who ends up in the criminal justice system. And I want to be a part of the solution to that problem. So when I was thinking about this summer, I remember this awful thing that happened in Charlottesville. And I remember seeing this image of a handful of kids. Some were white, some were black, and they're standing in front of this banner that said, "Virginia Students Against White Supremacy." And all around them, there's the awful people with the tiki torches. You remember the tiki torches? You could see some swastikas on some of those flags. Some of these were members of the Ku Klux Klan. I remember thinking to myself, what am I going to say to my kids and to my grandkids that I did when our values were so obviously under attack? And I want to say I stood up, and I fought back, and I pounded my fist on the table, and I screamed till I was hoarse that this is not the kind of America that I want to live in. And so, how are we going to make this happen? We've all been involved in campaigns that understand the grassroots. right? That respect and empower and include people across the Commonwealth. Those are the campaigns that are successful, right? The Elizabeth Warren campaigns, the Deval Patrick campaigns, the Maura Healey campaign. And we've been involved in some campaigns that sort of talk the game about grassroots and don't actually do it. I want to travel all across the Commonwealth. I want your support. I want you to caucus for me, but I want your help. Because the way that we're going to take back the corner office is neighborhood by neighborhood, town by town, city by city. Jess Lieberman, who runs my campaign, is here. We have a sign-up sheet. I would love to pass it around. I would love to stay in touch with you, because together we can take back the corner office, but we can also take back our sense of what America should be. So thank you. Do we have time for questions?
I was just going to say, anybody have any questions or comments?
Karen.
Yeah, I like what you're talking about in terms of criminal justice reform and social justice. I'm wondering what your vision is, or what your plan would be to address things in Massachusetts, such as voter suppression. But also, I'm thinking maybe even more specifically, like we just decriminalized marijuana. Would you be in favor of commuting sentences for people who were convicted and put into prison on low-level marijuana possession or offenses like that?
Sure. Thanks for your question. There's a terrific question. So let me talk first about expanding access to the franchise. So I think that it's really shameful that we have one party in this democracy that sees its role as its path to victory as shrinking the number of people who can be involved in the political system. And so what we need to do is we need to systematically address the barriers that people face to registering and voting. Massachusetts has a pretty good electoral system in the sense that we don't have as much voter suppression of the sort of classical sense as some of the states that I've done work in, such as Ohio and Pennsylvania. But we are far from a leader on some of the really progressive reforms that we could enact. So one of the things we should do right away is we should pass automatic voter registration. There are too many people who show up at the polls who are prevented from voting, not because they're not eligible, and not because there's any danger of fraud, but for purely bureaucratic reasons. We ought to do that right away. We ought to have early vote for all elections. We ought to have same-day registration. And we ought to think about some of the things that have worked in other states, like vote by mail. And we ought to also try to take some of the corrupting money out of politics. So there's an initiative petition. There's also a piece of legislation about Citizens United. We absolutely need to move towards a system that takes money out of politics. And this is more a national issue, but we really have to do something about gerrymandering. So there's a lot of things I think we can do on the voter suppression side. On the criminal justice reforms, there's been some good progress on Beacon Hill recently, and I applaud the Senate and the House, and they're trying to work out some important things. One of the pieces of that I think is really exciting is removing some of those mandatory minimums. But I think that there's a lot more that I don't have any optimism is going to be dealt with in this particular round. And let me sort of mention a couple of things I think we ought to do. One is bail reform. We need to do more about people who are accused of a crime, who are kept incarcerated before they're adjudicated on the merits, who are prevented from leaving just because they're poor. What we essentially do is we keep poorer people in the criminal justice system and richer people go free. We are criminalizing poverty, and the consequence of that is that young people, usually people of color, are growing up without their parents in the household. Those folks can't work, and those folks have very bad choices in terms of some of their plea bargaining. Another thing we ought to do is focus more on reentry, right? So when people are coming out of the criminal justice system, we ought to do more to help them get back on their feet, help them be able to reenter the economy, reenter our society. We're not doing enough on that. We're not doing enough on mental health. We're not doing enough on substance use services. And so there's really, we have a system, and we all see the numbers, but there's a huge civil rights problem, and we're losing a lot of productivity, and a lot of people are caught in cyclical poverty because of those issues.
Quick comment on public college tuition.
Sure. So, I mean, here we have a situation where, you've got a whole generation of people who are being bankrupted and who are starting out. I was talking to somebody the other day, and she said she and her husband, they're in their 30s. She and her husband still have 6 figures of debt. Just to claw out of that, it really changes your decision making in terms of, can you buy a home? Can you start a family and those sorts of things? So I think we ought to do something about that. I think that this is one of the reasons why I'm so excited about this millionaires tax. So one difference between I think where we are and where the governor is the governor thinks that all of this is about stretching our dollars farther, and there's a real lack of leadership on some of these real issues. I think we need to pass a millionaires tax. I think we need to make people at the very, very top. These are people. This is not $1 million where you add up the value of your home and your 529 and your 401k. No, these are people who are clearing $1 million a year. We're asking them to pay a little bit more, so we've got some resources to deal with some things like college affordability, early childhood education, and some transportation issues, some opioid issues. So I really think that the answer to that is we need more revenue, and then we need to invest it in things that are really a serious obstacle to people participating in our economy.
Hi. There was quite a bit of tension between the Clinton and the Sanders in the election around that.
Sure was.
And some of that has continued to spill over. And we have the 2018 elections coming forward.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about strategies on how to mend that so it's not a spoiler or it doesn't continue to split the vote? Any grassroots strategies that you can, or consistent messaging that we need to engage in to prevent us from that mid-election catastrophe instead of us coming there united? Any thoughts about that?
No, I mean, I think this is a terrific question. I think it's a terrific challenge. Look, we have to come together as a party. The difference between the vision that these folks are articulating and our vision just couldn't be starker, and it is well past time that we come together as a party. We sort of focus on the races that are in front of us, and we sort of take our country back. And I think you're absolutely right. I do think that that's happening, right? I do think we're starting to come together as a party. I think where you're going to see the leadership is actually out of the grassroots, right? So I think a lot of people have been bemoaning the fact that that we're still waiting for a sort of national message, and I think the message is going to come from us. One of the things I'm really excited about is watching a generation of people who served with me in the White House and served with me in the Obama administration, young people all across the country, whether they're involved with the Obama administration or not, who are stepping forward and running for office. It's very exciting to see Nina here. It's just elected. But what the way that we're going to solve these problems is actually going to be over the course of a long period of time. Look at what the Republicans did, right? Going back to the Christian Coalition and Ralph Reed and Newt Gingrich, they made a decision in the early 90s to invest in races at a lower level all across the country, places that they hadn't historically won, and they built up a farm system in the state legislatures and these statewide offices, and then that came to fruition over the course of a couple of decades. And then fortunately, one of the things that happened to us when we lost the White House is we woke up and we realized not only didn't we have the White House, we didn't have the Senate, we didn't have the Congress, we didn't have the governorships, we didn't have the state legislature, and they'd taken over the courts. And I think that the build out of that is going to also have to come from the grassroots and go over the course of a really long time. And we need to invest in that now, and we need to fight everywhere. And I'm very excited that that's really the approach that Gus has taken, and a lot of the folks that in the leadership in the party are taking, which is, look, we got to fight out the red areas, we got to fight out the purple areas, and we got to fight out the blue areas, and that's how we're going to win. And I think it's going to be a really good year.
I was watching a program about Victorian England about when you had mentioned poverty, and after all the research and everything they did, they came down to simply the reason people are poor is they're not paid enough. We're fighting for the 15, and the way I see the petition, it's to 2020, should be now. I know when my niece goes to college in Florida, she keeps a 3.5 average, she goes to a state school free. What is Massachusetts, or what can you help, because you said you've dealt with poverty, and obviously in looking at just what's happening, we were just like the most expensive state, the average apartment is $21.17. If someone's working at McDonald's, obviously they're not living there. There's such a big disparity between what the poor make and what the poor can afford. And it's not, they did discover it wasn't their fault. It was because they weren't being paid a living wage. So with that in, how can you address that? And because that to me is an enormous issue.
Yeah, I think it's, so first of all, amen, right? That's absolutely right. And, we have an economy, both in Massachusetts and nationally where, you sort of look at the numbers and it's growing and unemployment's low. And the problem is that it's rigged, right? It's sort of the people at the very top, Wall Street and corporations and, the very wealthiest families get way too much a percentage of that pie. And part of that is policy. It's like what the Republicans did last week, right? With these giveaways to the very wealthiest families. And where does that come from? That comes out of working people's pockets. And we need to do exactly the opposite of that. There's some things that we can do right away, and there's some things that we're going to need to build towards. So the things that we can do right away, I think we can raise the minimum wage. I think we can get paid family leave. I think we do need to invest more in some of these longer-term policies like employment and training, like housing, like infrastructure, roads and bridges and schools. We need to sort of think both how are we going to make it possible for people to make ends meet, but also how are we going to make it possible to build an economy that actually works for everybody over the course of a bunch of generations. And so we need to kind of do both of those things all at once. But I do think that it's ridiculous that we have people who work hard every day and they still struggle to make ends meet in one of the wealthiest countries and one of the wealthiest states and wealthiest countries in the history of the world. And part of that, honestly, is politics, right? Right now, the Republican Party has been run by people who don't care about the problem. And we are the party of opportunity, and we are the party that's actually going to invest in working people and solving those kinds of problems.
Yesterday, a federal judge struck down the Weymouth Conservation Commission's order to try to stop a compressor station from being built all around the Fall River. As a potential advocate for our cities and towns, what's your opinion? Would you stand with Reentry and Weymouth in trying to stop this from being built?
Yeah, so make me smart on this. I've heard people talking about this. I've been talking to people in Weymouth about it, but make me smart on this issue and tell me what you think. I'm going to turn it around on you.
I'm sorry?
Can you? No.
He wants to know what the issue is.
No. Let me tell you one of the things I really love about this job, right? One of the things the job of running for office. This is a huge state, right? There's 351 cities and towns, right? And you spend a lot of time. You're in policy. You're a lawyer, whatever. You learn some things about some things. And the temptation when somebody asks you a question about a local issue is to fudge it, right? Yeah. The temptation is turn around and be like, oh yeah, I know, come pressure over. And if you do that, you never actually learn. One of the things that I have found really fun about running for office is I've been to 60, maybe 65 cities and towns over the last 3-4 months. If you actually keep your ears open, and you actually ask people the answer to some of these questions, you actually get a little better at it over time. So I'm sorry to say, but I'm going to turn the question around. Can you help me understand? Can you help me learn?
There's a company that wants to build a compressor station in North Weymouth. These compressor stations are typically built in remote areas because they have a tendency of exploding.
They have the potential, and this is in a neighborhood.
They do explode, and the location they're putting this is right next to the brand new, freshly built Fall River Bridge, and it surrounds a couple thousand, residents, including a lot of schools in the area. So my home actually is considered in an incineration zone right now if this thing goes up. So it boggles my mind that this is even still happening, and with this federal ruling. The cities and towns have kind of put up a couple of barriers to try to stop it. Because this has now come down from the federal government, it might slash all of that. It might push that all back. So I'd rather not live in an incineration zone. So
yikes, right?
Yeah, it's
that
not
sounds
what
crazy.
I like to say around my 6-year-old. So
yeah.
it's something that continues to be, but it's unfortunately that come up again. Apparently, it doesn't mean that the shovels are going in the ground tomorrow, but it's another step in potentially having this thing go up, so. I asked a lot of people about it.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I really appreciate you
Quickly.
today being here. I'll be as quickly as I can.
Good, John.
I'm a teacher, and one of the kids I have them working on iCivics. So that was great in terms of how you handled that question. iCivics allows them to act like their legislatures and everything. And you have that option, right, to yes, no, or the third one. That was good.
Very good.
MBTA.
See, that was quick, wasn't it?
So,
We're getting into local issues.
so
now.
no,
Well,
it's
regional,
a
quite
super important issue. So
Yeah.
look, this is an issue that we have inherited because of a lack of leadership by Charlie Baker, right? Charlie Baker was the Secretary of Administration and Finance when we did the big dig. He starved the transportation budget, and as a result, we have a system that doesn't work inside the MBTA area and it doesn't work outside the MBTA area, and the financing of it is all screwed up. And when we came back, when the Patrick administration came back and said, look, we need to invest in transportation, we've got some good solutions for how to do this, the answer was reform before revenue, we can't do this, we can't invest in the transportation system, and now they're sort of on the same, now they own it. Honestly, now, this is their mess. But we all live in it, right? And
Also,
we
the
need
legislature, they wouldn't
Sure.
go along with the governor's recommendation.
It's
for the
actually
amount of
gone
money it
on a
needed.
long time,
I
long
understand,
before
I
Charlie
understand.
Baker. It's
I don't
it's
want to
gone
get into
down
an all-out
a lot.
argument, but it's also the legislature, which is a Democratic legislature. They weren't willing to, there was a lot to go.
The T rate
but-
now needs about $17.5 billion between the big dig debt and what they have in deferred maintenance. It's $17.5 billion. We don't have it.
Yeah.
That's why the trains are falling apart, the rails are falling apart. I worked for the T for 25 years. This has
Yep.
been going on as long as I've been there. And unless we come up with $17.5 billion like
Yep.
right now,
Yep.
what you see in the commuter rail is actually going to get worse.
Yep.
It's not going to get better.
Yep.
The whole thing needs to be fixed.
Yeah. No, I think that's
And
absolutely.
Even if you went with the billionaires tax, you're going to add $2 billion. It's not enough. We need more money.
Yeah.
But that's the T. What about the highway department? How about Logan Airport? The amount of money that we actually need is just, wow. It's daunting. Which means it's going to have to come to us to foot the bill. It's that bad.
That's the way it
It's
always works
bad.
out. Yeah, that sounds right.
But it's not Charlie Baker's fault. It even goes beyond.
Some of it is though. Some of it is Charlie Baker's fault because his reputation is as
Even beyond development. It's gone on a long time.
It has.
So I can feel the hook coming at me. So I'm happy to dig in on the transition.
It's all nice, but we need lots and lots of money for all these programs, mental health,
Yeah.
mass health. It's just,
Great.
Just
even the
a
Department of
quick,
Families and Children.
just
it's
a quick comment, one of
Yeah.
the very few
I don't want to
things
get,
during the campaign season that the Trump camp and the Sanders camp had in common was, there was that trade bill, not NAFTA, the
Reentry.
other one.
Trans-Pacific
Yeah,
Partnership.
but the other one was
Right.
infrastructure, and he still wants $1 trillion for infrastructure, and Congress isn't exactly giving it to him, and I don't like to, use
They
in
got-
the same
they-
sentence.
They get
the,
the infrastructure and DACA
the
are on the
administration
same
and,
page and they can't agree on anything.
and
okay.
The great Mr. Noble has a question.
Go ahead,
know
great
you will
Mr.
allow
Noble.
I'm interested who you would like to be working with as a governor.
I think that we have 3 terrific candidates for governor. I really do. And I think that when people, look, people have not focused on this race yet, but I think when people turn to this race, and they're about to, what they're going to realize is two things. One is that we've got 3 terrific candidates for governor, and we're going to be really happy with whoever wins that nomination. And the other thing is that this is going to be a blue year, right? People have got this notion that somehow Charlie Baker is unbeatable. This is Massachusetts. If we can win in Alabama, we can win in Massachusetts. There's a blue wave building, and one of those 3 terrific candidates is going to be the next governor of Massachusetts.
Wow.
Very nice.
Thank you. So appreciate it. And we have been fortunate that we've had both of our lieutenant governor candidates. It's, right, there's 2 of you this year? We had Jimmy Tingle here last week. We've also had all 3 of our governor's candidates. So I think it's really been very helpful, and it's been very deliberate that I've tried to have them all come prior to our caucus too. That's important for you as well as the candidates to try to come and meet you and have you consider voting for them should you be a delegate to the convention, and to spread the good word about them.
Thank
So
you.
I thank you very much.
Thank you, Alicia.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.